This manhwa began with a bell rung and a lady who asked a girl if she was done with her preparation. The girl responded and seemed happy as she had received an invitation to the Duke's manor. That was her home on Cullinan Island, nourished by survivors of a destructive war on the mainland. She moved to the island at such a young age that she had no recollection of her life on the mainland. She had been invited to keep Lord Kylek, the sole heir to House Blackwell, also the rulers of that island company. He'd seemed to be battling an illness that made him unable to leave his manor. She remembered how her mother had asked her to be considerate to the Duke even if he treated her badly, as they owed a debt of gratitude to the house, as she stood in front of the door to the manor. The housekeeper opened the door, and Angie greeted her before following her inside. As she walked, she looked around and noticed there was no portrait of the young master yet. They arrived at his room, and the housekeeper informed her that she wouldn't be able to see his face. She was instructed that if anything seemed weird, she must call for help and only answer what she was asked, and she hurriedly responds. They went in and the housekeeper introduced her, but the young master seemed displeased and the housekeeper quickly apologized before taking her leave. The young masters asked her to sit by the window, and she introduced herself as Angie, and she proceeded to recount the tale of Cumean Sibyl, an ancient prophetess of ancient Greece. She stood outside in unbelievable shock as she remembered how he'd asked her to come back at the same time the next week and had also called her name, which seemed to have brought her a lot of joy, and also the young master watched her from his window as she hurried home in excitement. In a new scene, a boy decided to escape the island because he'd refused to accept the lies and deception spread by the Blackwell family. He believed that there was more to life than the island, so he'd set sail. As he rowed, escaping seemed surprisingly simple until he came across a structure. Astonished at how close he was to freedom, his boat suddenly lost balance and he was attacked. The next day, Angie practiced embroidery with friends, expressing her great desire to make clothes inspired by her favorite flower one day, and her friend Letitia gave her support. They switched and talked of how reports of dead animals being found everywhere all over the forest, when a man rushed to inform them of the death of Elliot caused by sharks in an attempt to flee the island. The family mourned for days, but it was strange that his mother had come to Angie and smiled without a trace of sorrow, almost as if the memory of that incident had been wiped away. The day arrived for her to visit the young master, and when she went to him she reported all her observations about Elliot's mother, and he offered her tea to calm her down and also asked that she keep her observations strictly between them, as others may find her suspicious for having such thoughts. She drank the tea with a smiling face and thought of how different it was from the islanders, so the young master asked her to take some if she liked it, and she thanked him. The young master then spoke about how the story she'd told the last time about the prophetess was how she'd wished for immortality, and once she'd been granted it and watched her body wither, she'd realized that it wasn't a blessing but a curse, and asked what her answer would be if Apollo came to her and offered her immortality and eternal youth. She told him she'd turn it down, as even the most beautiful and exquisite flowers wither, and as he pondered, the housekeeper reminded them Angie's time is over. When she took her leave, the housekeeper asked what he thought about the new remedy, but he seemed to be irritated by the term remedies. The young master recalled how he'd asked his father what the term meant and how he'd said that they are chosen by his blood to preserve their masters by offering blood until they wither, which made him more determined never to walk the same paths as his father. Later at noon, Angie and her friends discussed the rumors of the Duke having other heirs who'd passed away shortly after their birth, except the young master, then the Duchess, who passed away also. A girl with red hair asked if they'd heard about his face and how he usually covered it, and when he did that he looked like a monster, and also rumors of him hitting his servants, but Angie stopped her from going further, also defending the young master, but they asked if she'd seen him in person, and she recalled her mother's warnings to keep her visit a secret and quickly denies it, saying it doesn't seem right to exchange such gossip since the Duke's generosity was what had brought them to prosper. The next day, Angie went to the manor to visit the young master, and after waiting for 20 minutes without seeing him, she fell asleep while sitting on the ground. The young master arrived and met sleepy Angie and also took off his jacket for her. He reached for her face and recalled how he'd been informed of the rumors spreading around the children and how she'd thought of him not as a terrible monster but protected him. He'd also asked the butler not to concern himself with it as not taking care of the person spreading such rumors. He wondered how it was possible that she had a different mindset from the others, and it made him want to expect more. Then he placed his hand above her and said he wanted her to himself. She tried to get up, but he asked her to close her eyes as she wondered if it was truly the young master. He told her that she needed to leave that day as he had urgent matters that needed his concern and she should visit 3 times a week from then on. She smiled, which brought a smile to his face as he got up. Later, as she assisted her parents with laundry, she spotted the roses already in bloom used to create a powder mixed with water for the islanders to consume and proceeded to smell it. She is reminded of her last visit and blushes, but also remembers how she'd brutally been turned down when she proposed pulling back the canopy slightly and how he'd sent her cookies she'd enjoyed there and even how she'd managed to make him laugh. She thought of how she'd like to see him one day when she hears a sound and reflects on how there'd been news of dead animals being found around when her mother called and asked if she was done with the laundry. As she turned to leave, a man who looked like he'd been watching her stood in the forest. Later, she is dropped off by a carriage holding a bouquet of flowers as she wonders what the Duke might think of them. Time went by, and the next time she visited the manor, she was 18. In those 3 years she and the young master's relationship underwent many changes, like him asking her to address him as Kai instead of Lord Kylek, and even having dinner at his place, and her ununderstandable feeling to get a glimpse of him. It was winter and she was seated in the young master's room. She seemed to have caught a cold, as she usually did every winter. The young master asked if there was anything she wanted for her 18th birthday coming up, and she thought of how he'd usually just surprise her without asking, but he told her he wanted to give her something to honor her coming of age. As she was about to speak, she heard the young master cough. She tried going to him, but he stopped her and called for the servants, who escorted her out as she watched him in pain. After leaving, she visited the church and prayed for the health of the young master before leaving. On her way home, she saw some people talking. Even though she was concerned by what it could be about, she thought not to concern herself with it and headed home. Once she arrived at home, her parents informed her that she had received a letter from House Blackwell, and as she read its contents, she realized it was from Kai, informing her that he'd need to focus on treatments for an unknown period and he still wanted to know what she'd like for her birthday. At the manor, the housekeeper informed the young master that he'd need to receive a blood transfusion from the remedy quickly, but he reminded her that he had no intentions of doing so she shouldn't make him repeat himself, as he would never let any harm come to her. They exchanged another letter, and in that letter Angie wrote how much she desired to see his face above every other thing, and he called her name quietly and thought to himself how much he's found himself enchanted by her and how much he must try to hold himself back whenever he saw her beautiful lips, and if after learning of his secrets she'd remain by his side. That night, Angie enjoyed different desserts with her family, and her mother asked about how teaching the children in the chapel to sing had been going. As she wondered what song she'd teach next, a strange melody played in her ear, and when she asked her parents about it, they didn't seem to have heard it before. She said good night to her mom, who promised to make something nice for her the next day, which was her birthday. She went to bed trying to remember where she'd heard the song when she found her surroundings unfamiliar and a person calling out to her asking if she knew the song. She woke up to a knock from her mother asking her to come out, as a present also arrived for her from House Blackwell. She picked up the gift and opened the letter from Kai. The gift was presented to her as a lover of snow, and in the letter contained news of his recovery and how he'd be able to grant her wish in 10 days' time. She held the gift from Kai closely and smiled with satisfaction. Her mother informed her that hers and Kylek's birthday was only just a day apart. He'd kept it as the Duke detested any form of extravagance, so she had to keep it a secret. Angie carelessly expressed her worries about the Duke in front of her mother, but she only reminded her never to voice such thoughts in front of others, as they had different backgrounds. In a new scene, Angie prayed in the church for the health of the young master, as she had to wait only 4 more days till she met him. On her way out of the church, she overheard some people talk about the need for blood transfusion and a remedy, and when she got out she tried to think of what their conversation could have been about when a man walked up to her and introduced himself as the nephew of the caretaker of the chapel, Hester, and she suddenly remembers the face, how she'd met her the last time she'd gone to pray. He offered to escort her home, but she refused and hurried home. She had the same dream again, but this time there was a sudden fire and he managed to tell her his name along with a message that she shouldn't forget him, Martin Silva. She got up and heard a scream from outside similar to the one she'd heard in her dream, but when she got out she almost got attacked by a figure like a shadow, but a man appeared out of the forest and before he could say anything she fainted. Kai held her and asked how he was supposed to give her birthday gift. He looked back and said it seemed his father had finally settled his thirst and he didn't know how she ended up outside, but the island and the forest both were perilous, so she should wait a little longer till he has the strength to protect her, and swore to break his curse with his own hands. The next morning, as soon as Angie woke up, she went straight to her mom and asked how she'd gotten home, but her mother seemed to be oblivious of her whereabouts the previous night. She sat with her mom and her mother explained to her that she must have had a bad dream as she didn't hear anything at night and her boots were in perfect state, and even when she'd gone to her room around dawn she was sound asleep. Angie sensed something strange as she could remember going out into the forest and meeting a man beautiful beyond belief and the man in her dream. As Angie thought to investigate later herself, her mother informed her of the improvement in the health of Kai and she thought of how her prayers must have reached the heavens. In a new scene, Angie is seated in a carriage and as she looked out of the window she remembered how the butler had sneaked her a note and told her parents she was going to be taken for spring cleaning as they were short of staff. She recalled opening the note and getting excited as Kai had instructed her to meet him that night in a garden. She arrived at the garden and when she saw the body of the man she became stunned as he was the same man from the forest. Kai greeted her and she held her mouth as she called him. She asked about the forest incident and he said he was also the one as she'd fainted due to shock, so he carried her home and also got rid of any traces. He asked what she was doing there and she replied saying she'd heard a strange noise, so she'd gone to investigate, and when she asked, he claimed to have been woken by the same noise and it was only later that he'd found out there was something wrong with the wind scythes. As Angie wondered if the noise had really come from the wind scythes, Kai softly moved her hair behind her ear and raised her head up before asking if she liked her birthday as she blushed. He asked for her permission to step a little closer and as he held her hand he told her that she could push him away anytime if she felt uncomfortable, and she thought of how possible it could be that she wouldn't want him as she kissed him. The two shared a sweet kiss and she felt herself enjoying his sweet breath as he held her. Suddenly it hit her that she'd kissed the sole heir to House Blackwell and she slowly moved backwards. Kai asked if she was all right, to which she said no, and when he asked if he'd done what she didn't like she also said no, as she'd also wanted it for long, but as they'd come from different circumstances they were impossible. Kai then told her that she need not concern herself with that as she knew just how precious she was to him as he looked up to her. At the other side, the young master's father says how precious he is to him and how he wanted him to live out the rest of his life soundly as it was his only wish, and to do that, they must deploy whatever means, be it witchcraft, drugs or a remedy, as it was a must to save him at all costs. Kai asked Angie if she didn't know, and if she didn't feel the same way it would be another matter, but she grabbed his hands and told him that she felt the same way and she'd always dreamed of the day she'd be able to see him face to face, but due her humble background she feared for them to get any closer. He took a breath before telling her that his mother was the daughter of his father's piano tutor and him being Kai Blackwell shouldn't pose a threat to their relationship, and he just wanted to hear an answer from her heart. She took his hand and confessed how she'd felt towards him, and he looked at her before embracing her. In a new scene, a young man with blonde hair was seated wide awake on his bed and he reflected on how he'd seen her again, a blonde girl who'd been appearing in his dreams, but she was with the Kai Blackwell this time around. On Cullinan Island, Angie remembered how Kai had told her that he'd have to get treatments for longer as the new drug was still undergoing trial and error, so they might not be able to see each other for a while. Angie unknowingly wished out loud for Kyle's health to get better, and as she worried about whether or not someone might have heard her. The name of the boy in her dreams suddenly popped into her head and she thought to check the island register, but to her surprise there was no one with such name. She came to the conclusion that he was a ghost and asked the person in charge of the register if there was anyone who tried to escape the island but had gone to a bad end, and he said Elliot was the first case and she could take a look at the death register if she liked. Letitia arrived and pulled Angie outside, and as they were joking around the two girls asked them to join them in the sewing room, but before she could respond she realized that one of them was missing, and in particular the girl with red hair, but the other girls didn't seem to. Notice. Hester suddenly arrived and asked the girls to go home as just that morning the Duke Blackwell had passed away. Kylek went to his father and knelt in front of him and said it was strange that his father has finally passed, but it seemed to him that his father was never truly alive and his mother must have seemed like that to his father as well, since she was just his remedy and the only person he ever loved. He reflected on how ever since his mother's passing his father changed drastically, accepting any blood transfusion that was available until he met his end. This led the young master to question what his fate will be, whether he will be able to break the curse and reclaim a life of his own. Angie sat in her room saddened from the news of the death of the Duke and also worried about Kyle when her mother walked in and informed her that they'd be needing her help like last time at the manor, and she wondered if she'd get to see Kai. Her mother reassured her that everything will be all right as they already had a new Duke, which was Kai, but she was worried about his treatments failing. Again, her mother reassured her by telling her that he might have to seek treatment outside the island, but she struggled to believe that since it was a popular belief that the ocean was infested with sharks. But her mother told her that during a time in the year the sharks migrate and the moon changes color, so it becomes possible to sail across, and also the last Duke sailed across with that information in search of medicine 8 years ago, but he lost his attendants in a storm and was forced to return home, so he never told anyone about it as it would have led people to make dangerous attempts to leave which could have gotten them killed. At the funeral of the Duke, Angie thought about how Kyle might not attend the funeral since he never showed himself to people, and when she looked away she saw a man and mistook him for Kyle. He was the same man that had offered to escort her home that day after church. He mentioned her skill at embroidery and she asked him to call her Angie, to which he asked her to also call him Mikhail. Another time she tried to step out for some air when she ran into Mikhail and they chatted for a while about how he recovered from his illness and also went for a stroll, but as she was walking down the steps she tripped and he caught her. She quickly moved, but he noticed some needle marks on her arm which he also had, but they both had no clue as to where they'd gotten it from. The scene of him taking a closer look at Angie's needle marks was caught by the new Duke, and he didn't seem pleased about it since she would be there for 10 days with a strange man who'd already managed to get that close to her. Later at night as Angie laid down to sleep she saw Martin in her dream again, but this time he was able to speak and he managed to tell her that the roses on the island contained drugs and she must avoid drinking it, as if she did that she would slowly remember who she was before she came to the island. She raised her hand and tried to stop him from leaving, but she felt someone hold hers, and when she opened her eyes it was Kai beside her. He slowly parted her head as she called him and he smiled. She asked when he'd gotten there and he apologized for entering without permission. He took her hand and confessed how he only wanted to catch a glimpse of her face, and she blushed. She told him his presence had made her feel at ease and tried lighting a candle, but he stopped her saying he'd soon take his leave. He kissed her hand and she asked if he was okay as she was worried about him physically and mentally, but he couldn't get the scene earlier out of his head and replied that he was all right since there was someone who cared so much about him. He slowly moved his hand as he told her that he'd like to talk to her about something when his treatment was complete concerning their future. The next morning as Angie was making tea she found herself hung up over the kiss she'd shared with Kai the previous night. She tried to think about what he meant by their future when suddenly the tea spilled over. She also remembered how Martin had warned her not to drink the rose tea, and as she cleaned up the mess she'd made, someone called for her. Several days passed since she'd stopped drinking rose tea and she finally began to regain her memories, even the memory about the red-haired girl and her name, which was Lucy, but none of the other girls had remembered her, almost as if she'd vanished from their memories. When she finally arrived at home she reported to her mom that strange things had started happening to her and told her all about the man that had been appearing in her dreams and telling her to leave the island, and asked her mom if there was a possibility that they didn't know anything about the island. But her mom told her that she'd have to go to Dr. Johnson the next day and she should keep those thoughts out of her head, as she seemed to find it hard distinguishing reality and fantasy because of her book, so she should only focus on her embroidery and stop reading. That night while Angie was asleep her mother came into her room with a blue liquid and poured it into her jar of water before saying they'd continue to live happily on that island. The Duke seemed to have finished his treatments and thought to invite Angie over again to share the news, while Angie's parents visited the housekeeper to talk about Angie's dreams. The housekeeper reassured them that there was no one who'd managed to escape the island as they were all captured and dealt with, and if she continued drinking the tea there would be no further issues and she would provide them with more sedatives. She handed her the blue liquid saying it would help her sleep soundly during the night without any dreams. Before they left they kept raising questions about whether Angie will be okay, which made the housekeeper question their attachment to Angie like they were her real parents, and if something went wrong again with her memory they could deploy resetting her using amnesiac. On the mainland, Martin went to his father with his wife and they discussed his plan to go to the island on a sailboat, and he reassured his father that it will all work out and he'd be in perfect health. His father remembered how he'd first met him and how he'd accused Duke Blackwell of abducting children and wiping their memories with a plant that grew on the island, and how he'd advised him to put an end to such thoughts, but he'd insisted that the targeted orphans who wouldn't be noticed and his daughter might have been mistaken as one. He recalled how when he'd asked why House Blackwell would commit such a crime he learned for the first time about the curse of eternity, and it required flesh and blood to obtain something humans should never covet. On the island, Angie gifted Mikhail a handkerchief as a gift, and to him it meant everything since it was the first time she'd ever given him anything. He called her attention to his name, which she spelled as Mikhail instead of Mikhail, but when she offered to make him a new one he refused. They talk, and as their conversation continues Angie thinks of how she'd stopped having any dreams for some reason and how she didn't want to take the tea. In the manor, the housekeeper talked about Kylek's upcoming succession ceremony, which meant he'd have to go to the mainland to meet the king, but Hester asked about Mikhail, to which the housekeeper responded that she had things well in hand and they need to find a new remedy for the new duke, as even though Angie's blood was the most compatible they could do nothing as he was so adamant about the matter, and while pointing at Letitia she says they just have to find another person suitable. That night while Angie was asleep her parents discussed, and her mom seemed to have second thoughts about drugging Angie, but her father encouraged her not to let her resolve weaken. The mother asked if he didn't sense that Angie held a special place in Kylek's heart more than his maid, as even the gift he sent that afternoon and the expression on Angie's face while she held the dress. Angie quietly listened to her parents and reflected on how she'd been falling asleep quite quickly after drinking the water her mom gave her before bedtime, and she'd first thought it was a side effect of not drinking the rose tea, but when she saw the note hidden in the gift she thought to not drink the water that night. Angie slipped out of her house that night with many questions in head about why her mother had drugged her and what she'd meant by the second step as she hurried to Kylek, who welcomed her with a smile. She was still worried about Kai's health, but he reassured her that it was okay as he loosened her hat. He caressed her cheek before asking if she remembered the lace with marigold, and she said she did, as she was the one who made it and had never expected the day it'd end up as part of her dress, but he told her he wanted to give her something more meaningful. She thanked him and looked at him, wondering if he was truly unaware of everything that was happening and even what people thought about them, and if he was also oblivious to the secrets on that island. Angie told Kai that she wasn't sure she could accept such a gift, but he told her that she deserved everything and more. He then told her that he'd been waiting until his treatment was over to tell her to allow him the honor of holding her in his arms that night. Their clothes moved to the floor and Kai on top of Angie, and as he loosened her clothes he also asked her to not be afraid, as she could push him away whenever she wished, as he just wanted to share his whole self with her, and she thought of how she felt the same way and longed to hold him, so she couldn't hold back as she just wanted to feel his warmth. He took her hand and kissed it and called out her name before saying she wouldn't know how long he'd waited for that particular moment. After that night, they got together several nights after that, strengthening their bond both physically and endless nights of ununderstandable longing for each other. But this particular night, as Kyle buried his head in Angie's body and she felt his warmth that she'd longed for and also his breath that seemed so sweet to her, those nights seemed endless, and outside the room stood Mikhail. That night, they decided to go for a walk, but Kai worried about Angie's stamina, but she refused him carrying even though she truly had no energy left. As she moved forward, Kai crept up behind her back and asked that they take a leisurely stroll, as he had something to show her. When they arrived, she was overwhelmed by the amount of fireflies that she'd noticed the beautiful overview of the village a little late. She jumped in excitement, and Kai mentioned how his mother and father used to go there before they got married, and she was the first person he brought there. As she gasped in astonishment, Kai asked if she remembered when he'd said he wanted to tell her something about their future. He held both of her hands together as he called her name. He told her that he used to observe her from there sometimes, as he'd heard that on days she wouldn't come she'd help her parents with work, and perhaps the feelings had started to grow by then, but it was way before that, as a look at her sweet face made him feel alive and he wanted her to share in that joy as well. He calls her name softly and then asks if she would go with him to the mainland. She pulls back in confusion and he tells her that everything she'd been told about the mainland were false and there were countless people building new lives there. He tells her his succession ceremony would be held there and he intended to settle there after receiving his title. He tells her there were many things he'd wanted to tell her, but he had to wait until the treatment was over and he can now share with her one thing at a time, and everything he neglected to do until then he will set right, and when he does he hopes she'll be right by his side. In another scene, some men are relieved that they've finally arrived at the mainland. The next day a girl rushes to meet the others asking if they'd heard the news about the nasal ship that washed up ashore and that the captain of the ship had met with Lord Kylek. She recalls how the captain had expressed his thrill at being swept away by a storm to the very place they were searching for, and how he'd explained that the island must have remained safe until then due to the thick fog that made the waters around the island seem impassable, saying it must have been divine providence. The girl tells the rest that he'd said the world beyond the island was now safe, although they still needed to observe the situation for a few years, and Angie sits quietly with her embroidery. She recalls how Lord Kylek had proposed she went with him to the mainland, and even though it was strange, it was clear that everything the blonde-haired man from her dreams had said were true, which meant he existed somewhere off the island, and most likely what he said about the rose tea was true. She wonders if it was due to the new drug he'd stopped appearing in her dreams, and even though she wished she could find out more, she didn't want just answers, because she wanted to help Kai as much as she could, because he'd been sick for so long that he probably wouldn't know much about what was going on the island. Angie spots Letitia biting her nails nervously, so she goes to her and asks if she's okay, but Letitia just asks her if she's met Lord Kylek before. Angie asks her what she means, and she tells her she supposed there was no reason she would have, since such opportunities were rare, and Angie wonders why she was bringing up the Duke all of a sudden, but she couldn't bring herself to ask because she'd never seen her look so frightened before. There is an awkward silence between the two for a while, and finally Angie speaks and asks her to let her know if she ever needed her help, whatever it may involve, and Letitia leans on her shoulder as she says thank you, and she also tells her she really was the person she cherished the most in the whole world, but as Angie pats her she wonders why she hadn't realized at that time that she'd made an enormous mistake. Later, as the Duke stands with Jerome, he tells him he'd sometimes picture the look in his mother's eyes as she gazed at his father amidst the burning flames the day she'd learned the whole truth, and what words she would have exclaimed at his father as her face turned so pale that not even a single drop of blood remained. He tells him that his father had genuinely loved his mother, but he'd realized too late, and maybe that was why he was so desperate to avoid doing anything that he'd later come to regret. He turns to him and says he was a devoted servant to his father, so he wouldn't hold it against him if he chose to walk a different path from his, but if he stood in his way, however, he would suffer the consequences. And when he asks if he understands, he says he respects the wishes of both him and his father, and Lady Gertrude, who stands outside listening, says that won't do, because if things went on like that there would be trouble, and perhaps it will be best for her to take action first. A fortnight later at the Duke's manor, Angie's friends ask her to hurry to them and she rushes. Lord Kylek's succession ceremony was officially announced, and he was to depart with the naval officers to receive his title, so a 3-day banquet was organized for the members of the Cullinan Island before he left. The people were simple, intrigued by the idea of the mainland, a new world to be in, full with anticipation to catch a glimpse of the face of the Duke-to-be, and Angie wonders if the people had been suppressing their curiosity about the island and Kyle because that was what was expected of them, and it maybe had been no less easier for Kyle also. Jerome walks up to Angie and asks her to come with him for a while, and as she wonders if Kai wanted to see her, she agrees. As Letitia walks with her father, she passes by Angie without knowing. Her father was a treasurer of House Blackwell and also an administrative supervisor. He tells Letitia he hopes she's prepared, reminding her that mistakes of any kind wouldn't be tolerated as she held the future of their family on her shoulders, and just then, Lady Gertrude walks up to them. Her father asks if they will be going straight to Lord Kylek, and she says they will start by discussing some matters with her first, and as Letitia's father follows Gertrude, she stands terrified, and her father asks why she is standing there like a fool, and she immediately follows him. Angie walks with Jerome to a house, and when she hears a familiar voice call her, she turns around to see Kai walking to her. He first assures her that no one can enter where they are before hugging her, telling her how much he's missed her. Angie asks him if he's sure he can be there with her, and he tells her that nothing interests him more than being there with her, and she stays quiet before finally telling him she'd thought a lot about what he'd asked her the day the fireflies surrounded them on the mountain cliff. She thinks of how she'd be lying if she said she wasn't afraid, but still an idea occurred to her that even before she had mentioned the mainland to her and before she'd met Martin, or perhaps earlier when she met someone who had an interest in things beyond that island, she might have already been anticipating the day she would set foot in that new world. So the moment she'd heard Kai's words, the first emotion that surged through her was excitement. If she could go with Kai to the mainland, and she tells him she would love to go. She takes his hand and says she wants to go to the mainland with him, although it did weigh heavy on her heart that she'd have to leave her parents and friends behind, and he assures her that even though it would take some time, he would see to it that her loved ones are eventually able to settle in the capital. As she smiles happily, he tells her it's his turn and takes out a jewelry box, revealing the sacred tears, a jewel that had been passed down through generations of women in his family, and as he places it on her, he tells her his father had given it to his mother and now he wanted to give it to her. She tells him she doesn't know if she can accept it, and he asks who else he'd give it to if not her. He tells her he'd originally wanted to give her a necklace and a ring, but tradition dictated that they exchange them upon making their vows. She holds her mouth in disbelief and asks if he was sure, since she had nothing to her name and there was only so little she could offer him. As she explains that he was from House Blackwell, a collateral line of the imperial family, whereas she, Jerome, tells the Duke he'd have to leave. Kai gives Angie a letter asking her to read it, saying it contains everything he wants to tell her and it should have all the answers she needed. He kisses her forehead and says he'll be in touch soon, and by then they'll be preparing to leave the island. Angie stands alone with the letter slid in the waistband of her dress, and just as she explains her feelings, Mikhail rushes to her and informs her that her friend Letitia seemed to be in trouble. When she finally gets to her, she asks if she's okay and if she hadn't mentioned that she wouldn't be able to attend the banquet, but Letitia hits her off, leaving Angie speechless. Letitia asks Angie why she'd lied to her and reminds her how she'd asked if she'd met Lord Kylek before. Angie, now struck by the realization of her lie, recalls how she had feigned ignorance when Letitia asked her. She asks Letitia if she was there to meet with Lord Kylek, but she just tells her she doesn't know anything, same as how she didn't know how much she'd wanted to run away. Letitia recalls walking with her father, ignoring the hesitant feeling, but most of all she couldn't get rid of the fear of seeing the Duke because of the rumors around his appearance. She'd asked her father if it was too late to reconsider, and just as her father was about to respond, Gertrude interrupts and says her friend Angie had willingly taken on that role before her. Letitia asks Angie what Lord Kylek is like and afterwards says she doubts she'll answer her now since she'd kept it a secret from her after all those years, and Angie tries to comfort her, but Letitia yells at her, asking her to leave. Letitia's unexpected outburst startled Angie, causing the letter to slip from the waistband of her dress. Mikhail suggests that they leave, assuring her that her friends would take care of Letitia so she didn't have to worry, and she accepted while Mikhail slipped the letter into the inner pocket of his jacket. In a new scene, Angie's Moo takes care of Angie, who seemed to have come down with a fever since the banquet, and Angie recalls how she tried to see Letitia since the banquet, but not only did Letitia refuse to see her, she also refused to see anyone, and she also lost the letter Kai had given to her. Her father walks in with a bag of medicine, and as he hands it to her mom, he tells her that dead animals' carcasses had been turning up near the woods again, and it was unfortunate since it had been months since the last incident had occurred. He asks Angie's mom if she's heard the news about the Duke and Letitia's engagement, and Angie interrupts and immediately sits up, demanding to know what her parents meant. Trembling, she repeats the question, asking her father if it was true and if House Blackwell had officially announced it, but the intensity of her emotions became too much for her frail body, so she passed out, and as her surroundings faded she could only think of how sure she was that all that remained was for them to move forward with their lives together, but she found herself asking where it had all gone wrong. In a new scene, a man visits his grandma, and it turns out he's the guy from Angie's dreams. His grandma welcomes him and he tells her it's still strange to hear her call him Philip, and she asks why since it's his real name, and he says since he'd spent years not knowing his real name. The lady with him introduces herself as Bryn, asking if the grandmother remembered her, and she says she knew Brianna, the daughter of the general store owner, and Martin tells her she was his fiancée and he'd brought her to meet her several times. As Martin worries about his grandmother's memory, Bryn goes down and says she'll visit more often, and the grandma says it would be wonderful to see their faces. They go in, and as he helps his grandmother with the chores he remembers how he'd risked his life to escape the island 9 years ago, and while leading an itinerant life he crossed paths with Bryn and instinctively rescued her, and putting away bad memories of the island they started a new life, and with the help of Wilhelm van Ametage he'd managed to find his long-lost grandmother and also discovered that his real name was Philip. His eyes fill with shock as he spots a frame. He picks it up and his grandma tells him it was the only surviving photo they had since the rest were all burned during the war, and she mentions that Bryn and his sister in the frame he was holding shared a similar aura. He looks confused, so his grandmother asks if he didn't know, and he tells her he hadn't completely recovered his memories. She comforts him and proceeds to tell him more about his younger sister. She mentions her name, which was Amber Wynn, and also tells him he and his sister used to like singing a particular song from their homeland, and she proceeded to sing it. As she sang it, memories from a long time ago with his sister and his mom together, all rushing back in his face, held both a mixture of shock and realization as he called out her name and said, "It all just came back to me." Later, Miklai asks someone in a cloak how much longer he has to wait, the person revealing to be Lady Gertrude, and she tells him it seemed he hadn't still fixed a habit of his. He asks her not to change the subject, calling her Aunt Hester. He reminds her of how he'd laid low all those years pretending to be sick until the former Duke passed away, and he asks if it wasn't time to reveal the truth already. She tells him she had spoken to Mirs Dunst recently, and it appeared that she'd made plans for Lord Kylek's engagement ceremony. She tells him orders may soon be issued, so he only needed to wait until then. He turns and spots Angie walking home and immediately turns his back, asking her to explain the rest when they met again, and as Gertrude watches him she calls his name and says his instincts might lead him to serious trouble. He gets to Angie and asks if she was all right, and she says even though her fever was gone she still felt weak. She recalls how she hadn't still heard anything from Letitia, and when she thinks of Kai her mood changes. She thinks of how hard it was to believe, and also how it could have been possible that everything he'd said to her, all the solace he'd offered and every promise he'd made were all lies, and even though she wanted to believe there were circumstances beyond his control it was hard to convince herself. Mikhail, taking advantage of the moment, tells her if it were to be him, he would never leave her side, and instead he would look her in her eyes and share his warmth with her whenever she needed it. Oblivious Angie asks what he meant, and as he leans in, he tells her he could ease her loneliness no matter what happens. As Angie tries to understand if he meant he liked her, Kai suddenly appears and asks Miklai who he thought he was to say such things. Kai calls him absurd for thinking he was a worthy substitute and asks how dare he do that. He tells in front of Angie and says it will be his first and final warning, ordering to never appear in front of Angie again. Miklai, looking upset, asks Kai if Angie was aware of just how dangerous he was since he'd been misleading an innocent young girl all those times. The Duke looks more annoyed before, and Angie quickly gets in his front, asking him what would happen if someone saw him behaving that way because he was yet to introduce himself to the people of the island. He takes Angie with him, and when they're seated in the carriage he asks Angie why she hadn't come to their meeting spot because he'd waited for her every night, but she just asked what he meant by that. He asks if she hadn't read his letter, and remembering how she lost it, she tells him she'd lost it the night he gave it to her. He tells her to allow him explain since there most likely would have been a misunderstanding, and she asks him if explaining it would change the fact that he would be engaged to Letitia. He turns to her and she asks if that meant she was right, and says it was exactly like the rumors had said and they were all true. She thinks of how it was all becoming clearer to her, and from the time and venue of the engagement ceremony to all plans thereafter it seemed like everyone except for her was happy, and it made the time they'd shared together feel like it was being invalidated, and eventually her very existence would also be. She tells him she'll return the brooch to him soon, as it was only right that a family heirloom be reserved for the future Duchess. Kylek asks her what she meant by that and assures her that that brooch belonged to her and he didn't like Letitia Durbin. He explains that just like he'd written in the letter, their marriage was nothing more than a marriage of convenience, and it seemed like there had been far too many eyes on them of late, so they should go to the capital. But Angie just withdraws her hand and asks if he was suggesting she become his mistress while working as a maid in his manor in the capital. He pleads with her not to say that, assuring her that whatever she was thinking wouldn't happen, as he would arrange for her to have her own house in the capital and she wouldn't need to interact with anyone from House Blackwell and no one will lay a finger on her. Kyle tries to explain to Angie the reason he just had to get married to Letitia, but she just sighs, and with her head in her hand she says, "Lord Kylek, had I known all this, I never would have gotten involved with you." She tells him she would have tried her best not to fall in love, and if that failed she would have never shown her true feelings. She tells him she would now take her leave, and as she holds the door, she hears Jerome call Kai. Kylek gets up with a sigh, places his hand on the door and says he's sorry, but he couldn't allow that as there was still much they needed to discuss. She looked at him terrified, but before she could ask what was happening she fainted. Jerome pulls the door open, but he pauses when he sees Angie asleep on the Duke's lap. Lord Kylek asks if someone had discovered their carriage and orders that they return to the manor immediately. In a new scene, the captain suggests that they seize their chance immediately. The fog lifts and a man asks what they should do and if the plan was just to simply locate the island and get close to it, and he says yes, and even though it could be challenging because of the storm he couldn't miss such an opportunity. He then suggests they set sail before the storm arrives and anchor at a rocky islet nearby and look for the island as soon as the fog cleared, and it all depended on whether he thinks he could weather the storm. Martin assures him that it would be no problem, and looking out of the window he says he has to find her, and as he says her name, Angie springs up and thinks of how Martin had said he was coming to find her. She looks around and asks where she was, and she turns to Kyle, who asks if she was awake. She asks how, and he apologizes, saying it was the best he could do, and like he'd mentioned there were many people watching her who wished her harm so she could relax because she was safe there. She pleads with him to let her go home and asks if all she had to do wasn't just to avoid being associated with him, since those people who were after her only wanted to prevent her from becoming a hindrance to him. She tells him no matter what he says she wouldn't change her mind about not leaving the island, and she'll continue living her life by her parents' side, and he should go to the capital and take up his duties for his succession, engagement ceremony and marriage. Kyle tells Angie he is sorry, but it was already too late, and it had been like that since the moment they'd confirmed their feelings for each other, or perhaps from the moment she'd set foot in the manor, and as he opens the door he pleads with Angie to not abandon him. Later, Kyle goes to Angie's mom, who informs him that Angie had gone to help arrange the annex of House Blackwell's manor, and she was summoned in a hurry the previous night since the Duke was preparing for his engagement and she'd only heard about it from Jerome. In the Duke's manor, Angie sits not knowing how many days had passed since she'd been there, and Kyle had been going in every night to silently look at her, and she could see in his eyes that he wanted a response she'll never give. She'd yelled and cried in anger, but they were of no use, and one time she'd thought of ending it all, but he stopped her and stayed with his head buried against her for a long while, and he'd looked as if he was silently crying. When he finally let go, he explained to her that his mother was a sacrificial lamb for a curse that his grandfather had created, and it was a curse so foul and terrible that defied one's imagination, and his grandfather called it the sublime miracle. He further explained that after discovering the curse's true nature his father decided to keep it from his mother, but it was only for a short while, since she found out one time while going through their family records, and without giving him a chance for explanation she set herself ablaze with her last words, "Not even in death will I forgive you." He explained that his father had lived in regret for the rest of his days, and he'd grown up seeing the weight of that burden, so he never wanted to experience the same regret his father did, and that was why he'd never let the salvation she'd given him be in vain. In a new scene, Lord Kylek orders a maid to prepare food that could be easily swallowed along with some warm water and milk, and once she leaves, Lady Gertrude says so he truly brought Angie there. Lord Kylek tells her that if he hadn't someone would have tried to harm her, and as she asks who would dare do such, he walks up to her and says perhaps a fanatic believer of Kylem who wants a remedy, or a member of household staff who views Angie as a thorn in the side. He assures Gertrude that he will leave the island as soon as the storm subsides and go on with the engagement plan, but under the condition that any more vials of amnesiac in the manor will be destroyed. She begins to stutter, and Kylek says if she disobeys his order there will be no further negotiations. Lady Gertrude asks why it had to be Angie if he really didn't know that when they'd failed to find a compatible remedy, Angie was chosen after much deliberation and she was sure he knew the reason better than anyone. Kylek responds that she'd mentioned that with the vitality she possessed it would be worth pursuing change this time and she was also convinced that she would be to his liking and that was the reason. As Angie sits up in bed with the heavy cuffs on her hand feeling nauseous and she wonders if it was because she hadn't had anything to eat. Her vision begins to get blurry and as she places her hand on her mouth and tries to track back when she'd last seen her period she hears a knock on the door. As she wonders who it could be since if they were just bringing her meal they will leave it by her bedside, she hears a familiar voice call her name asking if she was there. Mikhail pulls the curtain and when Angie asks how he tells her that Annette had told him she was locked up in there. He asks for the key to her cuffs and when she shows it to him he picks it up and informs her that the Duke was by the dock and there seemed to be an issue with the vessel destined for the mainland. He uncuffs her and tells her they didn't have much time so they should leave together and talk later. She asks if he wanted her to leave the manor and when he tries to suggest an alternative if she didn't want to, she tells him she did want to and she wanted to and together they slipped out of the manor unnoticed. Angie assures him she'd be okay so he should return to the manor and once she goes to the forest to reach the cliff the north shore was just below and once her parents arrive she'll be safe. He offers to walk her to the north shore and she agrees and thanks him. He tells her he is happy to help and as he holds her face he tells her there was something he needed to go tell her when they get there. They arrive at the shore and when he brings her tea, he asks how long she'd been locked up in the Duke's manor and she says maybe 4 or 5 days and he thinks of how it must have started that night. Angie tells him that Lord Kylek had wanted to take her to the capital with him but she didn't want to and that was how she ended up there and he asks what she planned to do since he wouldn't give up easily and she says she planned to tell her parents everything once they arrived. He tells him the whole island may belong to Lord Kylek and they might all be working for him but if her parents wanted her to remain on the island he wouldn't be able to do anything and even though she had no idea what he was thinking she knew he wouldn't be able to disturb the peace of the island. Miklai tells her the people of the island weren't as peaceful and innocent as she thought, though they tried to make it resemble paradise and she asks what he means. He tells her that the strange things that had been happening to her were all connected to the Black Mass. He tells how House Blackwell had gathered all the displaced survivors of the war was all planned from the beginning because they were monsters tainted by a curse. She asks him what everything he was saying meant and he tells her he'd overheard Miss Dunst and her close associates talking and they called miners like he and her that were living on the island remedies and the rest were called helpers who were working for House Blackwell. He holds her hand and says he was going to tell her the truth about everything so she had to believe what he had to say. After a while of explaining Angie asks if he meant to say that the Black Mass ritual called Eternity had been happening since the time of the previous Duke and a remedy must be sacrificed for the ritual and he says remedies are remedies because they are used as treatment in the Eternity ritual and he'd heard that all that was for the purpose of achieving immortality and eternal life. Terror spreads round her face as she remembers the conversation she'd heard the moment she'd gone to the church to pray for Kylek's health. Angie asks if he'd said the drug in the rose tea was called opium rose and he nods and explains that long-term consumption would result in gradual memory loss and it seemed to have no effect on the adults working as helpers because they developed resistance to it. She asks how remedies are sacrificed and then asks if they were all going to be okay now so Mikhail asks if that was really what she believed. He pulls up his sleeves and says he'd lied to her that his needle marks were from his illness but instead they were in the same position from the beginning and they just had no memory of it. Angie mentioned the red-haired girl that had disappeared and asks what he thought would happen to them once they'd outlived their usefulness as remedies and he says he doesn't know. He tells her they might be cast off the island after completely losing their memories and he was sure that the people of House Blackwell knew a way to get off the island and they'd just been preventing people from leaving to keep the island in complete isolation. She confirms to know if it wasn't monstrous sharks and fish that killed Elliot and he tells her they were lies made up by House Blackwell as he'd heard there was someone keeping watch at Wind and that person had unalived Elliot before mutilating his body afterwards and she asks how they could do such a cruel thing. Mikhail grasps her shoulder and tells her they were cruel and heinous beyond imagination and they only had one option which was they had to go to the capital together as it probably would be their last opportunity and definitely her last. She tries to speak about Lord Kylek, but she stops and thinks that if there was truth in what Mikhail had said, Kylek must know everything, and despite knowing everything, he'd. Miklai notices and asks if she was all right. He tells her if she was worried about her parents, all she had to do was make it a condition that she'll only leave unless they accompany her. He tells her once she's in the capital she can look for an opportunity to go somewhere far away and she could escape to anywhere in the world from there, and she just asks when the ship is set to sail. He tells her it will be delayed for a few more days and she should use the time left to make preparations and also persuade her parents to leave with her, and if she told them it was the orders of the Lord Kylek they will certainly agree, and she tells him that everything they discussed she planned to keep a secret from her parents, and since they were being used by the people of House Blackwell, she didn't want to say anything that might shock them, and as he agrees they hear a rumble. The ship of Martin is finally close to the island, and as he stands on the deck he hopes to find Angie. Angie's parents get back, and when she asks what they were doing there, Mikhail tells her that Angie had finished her embroidery work the day before, and since it was raining they decided to wait for them there. As Angie's mother worries about her pale look, Angie calls her and embraces her tightly, and her father invites Mikhail to have something to eat, but he turns him down saying he must be needed in the manor. Mukul leaves and her parents looks at each other as they recall their conversation with Gertrude, who'd asked if the most ideal one wouldn't be Lord Kylek settling down in the capital while Angie forgets about him and lives a peaceful life with the both of them, and she'd said if the amnesiac was truly safe to consume it would be better than Angie living unhappily, as staying with Lord Kylek will make her life difficult. Later, Mikhail runs in the pouring rain, recalling how Gertrude had explained that orders had been given to eliminate the thing when thunder strikes, and it was crucial that he fulfilled his proper role. He gets to the manor, and in the rain he says, "Kyle Blackwell, the thing you want will never be yours." In a new scene, Kylek asks if there's no other way, and the man apologizes, saying it will be a week at the earliest, and when he leaves, Jerome tells Lord Kylek it would be safer to set sail after the storm, but if the fog clears by then the people might get suspicious, and before what he plans to do, Kylek tells him it wouldn't be possible to continue deceiving people with shallow trick, as it would only be a matter of time before they come to discover that it was possible to leave for the outside world. He tells him eventually they will be allowed to leave freely since remedies were no longer of any use, and as Jerome nods a man rushes to inform the Duke that the Ristles had left the manor after speaking with Miss Dunst, and they discovered that the last vial of amnesiac had disappeared from the supply room. He also informs him that Angie had slipped out of the annex in the early hours of the morning and she was now at the North Shore, which meant they were going to use the amnesiac on her. Lord Kylek takes a horse and Jerome pleads to be allowed to escort him, but he just stretches his hand forwards and Jerome places something in his hand and he gets on his horse. Mikhail finally arrives at his destination and he hides from the others who try to hold down something. He gets into the cage and looks at one of the guards who pleads for mercy but eventually gets killed and covers his mouth. The thing gets out and Mikhail thinks of how he had no idea what it would look like, and as he picks up an axe he thinks of how he had to go after it. Angie in her home tried to persuade her parents to leave with her to the mainland to start a new life, and her mom tells her it wasn't as easy as she thought and she was sure the capital would be overflowing with skilled maids and workers, and asks what they could possibly do there. Her mom cups her face and says her wish was for them to remain on the island to keep it a happy and peaceful place, and as Angie says that was what she also wanted, but she feels nauseous again and she assures that it was only just a queasy feeling and she'd be better after lying down. She tells her parents Lord Kylek might come looking for her soon as she'd left without informing him, and when she sees him she must make her intentions clear to him, and she also pleads with her parents to reconsider her request and they could start a whole new life beyond that island. Her mother tells her she'd discuss it with her father and suggests she get some rest. Angie's father reaches for his inner pocket saying he'd brought some medicine for her, and after pouring it into a cup he tells her she must take it in one go even if it's a little bitter. She accepts, but as soon as she tries to drink it, they hear a gunshot causing her to drop the cup. When the gunshots finally stop she looks up in shock to find Kyle standing with a gun, and her parents both urge her to come with them. Mikhail finally gets out and as he looks around he spots the thing. Turns out he was John Fitzroy Blackwell, the founder of House Blackwell and the one who'd brought upon his family the most dreadful curse as he dared to forsake his humanity and venture into the domain of the gods, and as a result he became a bloodthirsty monster. He finally spots Mikhail, and as he tries to attack him, Mikhail kicks him to the ground and brutally hits him with an axe. Lady Gertrude and Miss Dunst both head to the cemetery, and Miss Dunst tells her there could be a risk of failure since they'd failed to subdue him on the first attempt, and he was immortal after all, and he'd come back to life even when shot in the heart, and even if his limbs are severed they promptly reattach, so the best option was to seal him alive in an oak barrel and cast him deep into the sea. They arrive at the graveyard and spot Mikhail in the distance hitting him several times with an axe before finally taking a lantern and setting his body ablaze. He drops the axe as soon as he spots his aunt, and he explains that at first his mind had gone blank, but then he got a vague premonition that he might be able to destroy it completely so it can never come back to life, and he did it. Lady Gertrude then smiles as she says it was now clear that Mikhail bore the blood of House Blackwell, and she turns to Hester saying she now understood and asks that they now pray for their future and for their late master. While Mikhail just stares at the flames as he says, "I hope you find rest in the depth of hell where you shall pay for your sins of daring to transgress taboos and challenging the realm of the divine." Kyle stands in front of the house, in his mind calling out to Angie, explaining that her parents weren't in their right minds as they were trying to harm her, and if they'd truly ever thought of her as their daughter they wouldn't be capable of committing such horrific acts. As Angie escapes with her parents, she tries to understand why Kyle would ever want her dead, and her eyes fill with realization as she understands that maybe his real target was something else. Her parents tell her they'd never allow her to be taken from them, and before they allow that to occur they'd sooner, but Kai shoots at them and asks them to step away from her as it would be his last and final warning, and he thinks to stop them before they administer the amnesiac. He urges Angie to come to him, and as her mom slowly retreats, pleading with her to explain to Lord Kylek that they weren't trying to hurt her and everything was for her sake, they get to the end of the cliff and fall to their death, leaving Angie with tears in her eyes. Kai tries to go to Angie, but she stops and says he'd killed her parents right in front of her eyes, and she asks if it was because they might stop him from taking her to the capital. He walks to her and drops the gun, telling her to allow him explain, and he wouldn't hide anything from her any longer, so she should believe him. And as Angie stands facing him, she thinks of how he probably had no idea that even in that situation she still found herself being swayed like a fool, and even though things had ended between them she found herself wanting to lean on him again, and she resented him for that. She finally speaks and says if it means she can escape him and the island, perhaps it is the best choice, and as she retreats, he pleads with her not to jump, and when he finally tries to go to her she jumps off the cliff. As Angie falls off the cliff she prays, "Please God, if I am in the middle of an awful nightmare, right, please let me wake up, but if not, please God, may you grant eternal blessing on this tragic demise." The seed nurtured in nature most perfect and bountiful shall become the roots of immortality. Those who gain eternal life shall pay the price with blood most intimately connected, reaping the blessing of an enduring lineage, a man reads. He agrees with himself and says if he didn't wish to lose everything he's achieved and for the sake of his family's continuity, he had no choice but to defy God. He speaks to some and asks them to remember that after obtaining the blood of the firstborn who first saw the light of the world, the second who will become the family's lineage shall drink a concoction mixed with that blood, and only then will they be blessed with eternity, the gift of everlasting life, and they shouldn't forget that in that process the remedy's sacrifice is indispensable, and that was the forbidden secret which their family must carry with them until their deaths. Lord Kylex wakes up and Jerome walks in with a tray and says if he wouldn't be able to anything solid then he could try some blood, but Kylek asks him to get the blood out of his sight as the mere scent of it made him nauseous. He asks about the search and Jerome reports that they were scouring every inch of the island but they were yet to find anything. Lady Gertrude speaks, saying once again she won't be able to see Lord Kylek, let alone discuss the schedule, and it had been a month since they'd been stuck on that island south of the capital, postponing both the succession and engagement ceremonies, and she wishes that they'd at least find a body. Gertrude tries to think of any definitive evidence that would surface and make him accept her death, but Letitia asks if there was no possibility that she could be alive. Gertrude tells her there was no such chance, so the succession ceremony had to be conducted within the next month, and the same went for the engagement. Tears pours down Letitia's face and Gertrude says it's unbelievable and she couldn't understand why Angie was so important to both her and his lordship. In a new scene, Martin, enjoying tea, asks if someone is all right and she thanks him for saving her again. He tells her she must still feel uncomfortable, and she explains that it was just hard to believe any of it, like how she'd met him in her dream, how she'd fallen deep in the water and how he'd miraculously saved her, and also the fact that they looked so alike. Martin confesses that he still found himself astonished and there was still plenty of time to get used to it since they were never going to part ways, but before that there was something he had to tell her. He asks if she knew about eternity, and when she says yes, he asks her to tell him how much she knew. He tells her that knowing about remedies, helpers and opium rose was enough, and they probably had to transfuse her blood until they'd successfully achieved eternity. He tells her it must have been painful, and she says she has no memories of them extracting her blood, and it was also thanks to everything he'd informed her in her dreams that she started questioning everything. He tells her he is glad to hear that they usually said twins had a connection that couldn't be explained by science, and they'd been separated for a long time, so maybe they'd unconsciously been drawn to each other the whole time through their dreams. He asks if she knew they were in the kingdom of Vintgar, and when she says yes, he tells her that they'd adopted a constitutional monarchy and were actively pushing forward with the Industrial Revolution. He tells her it is an entirely different place from Trieste, even though they shared a border, as Trieste used the Celtic language like them, but after the war, they insisted on an absolute monarchy, so there were peasants uprising from time to time, and all that was happening due to the greed of Trieste's current king Rainier VIII. He makes Angie understand that there were people in the world that would do anything for immortality, just like nobles, kings, merchants who wandered across the country amassing great wealth, and as they lacked for nothing, all they seemed above all else was the time to enjoy their wealth and power for as long as possible, and John Blackwell had succumbed to that temptation, so he'd sacrificed his eldest son only to be turned into the undead as a consequence, because the highest stage of eternity was the blood karma, which was the acting of killing the firstborn and consuming his blood mixed with a drug. Angie drops the cup in terror, and as she trembles she asks if it meant the same for Kyle, and Martin says yes, and his father, Edward Blackwell, had used the older of the twins as a sacrifice, and if Kylek had been born first he would have become a victim too. He tries to comfort her, but she just trembles as she holds her stomach and finally says she might be with a child, and even though she couldn't be certain, no one must find out, including Kylek. Later, Mikhail stands in front of Kylek as he tells him he was sure he was the one who'd opened the door to the bedroom of the annex. Mikhail admits it, and he tells him he was also aware that the thing had escaped the basement and attacked people and caused a fire that engulfed the garden and annex, and the flame eventually swept through the whole island and Angie could have been harmed, but Lord Kylek asks if he was saying he fancied himself to be her savior, and he says he was only saying the fire had taken too many lives and Cullinan Island had now become a wasteland thanks to the fire, and everyone who'd survived had come to Te. Damn, but they were only just a fraction of its original residents. Kylek tells him he would get straight to the point and he'll give him funds to leave the island, and since he'd converted what was his, he didn't want him around, and Angie was his from the beginning, and it still held true. Looking down, Mikhail remembers how his Aunt Hester had told him that her sister had a strange desire for Edward Blackwell, which she called love, and so she'd seized the opportunity at a ball to slip a drug into his drink, and that was how he was born. He remembers how she'd mentioned she'd now done her part, and when he asked if she meant he should leave her there, she told him if he really loved her he should cherish her. Mikhail confesses that it was true he'd liked Angie, and he'd also confessed to her, but he knew her true feelings, so he soon gave up, and he pleaded with the Duke to take back his order, promising to forget about the past and live a quiet life, fulfilling his duty of serving him. As he looks at Mikhail, he remembers how Jerome had reported that the person who'd shared a room with Mikhail saw the rose design fetched on his chest, and he'll look into it further, but it could be that. At that moment he flashed back to the moment Angie had first seen the rose design on him. She told him it was so beautiful and her eyes were constantly drawn to it. Later, Martin takes Angie to go visit their grandma, and when they get there, their grandma was so pleased to be reunited with both her grandchildren again. As Martin walks the grandma inside, Angie calls him, saying she had this faint memory of playing with kittens just in front of the house, and her grandma tells her she'd always loved cats and dogs, and there was a massive street Bernard and kitten. Martin asks if she remembered when one of them had run off with a cookie she was given, so she sat on the ground bawling, and she said yes. He tells Angie that his memories also started resurfacing when he visited places from his past, and he suggests they go for a walk together later, and just then, she gets another memory of them together again, and this time with their mother and father. She thinks about how clear things had become, that she finally realized that all the lies that surrounded her slowly gnawed away at the truth. She remembers Kylek and how peaceful their relationship was until the whole truth came out, and she just wishes she could forget him, so she rubs her belly and says, "My child, could you tell me how I can make myself genuinely despise your father?" 3 years later. Angie's son runs to her and her face lights up when she sees him. Bryn tells her that Noah had insisted on seeing her, so they got on their way there and she thanks her. Bryn asks her if she will be working late and she tells her she'll try to finish up in the afternoon. Bryn talks about how popular her embroidery designs had gotten among people there, and even the royal family that recently commissioned table mats and handkerchiefs and other things after that. Angie had taken several steps to build a new life for herself. She set up a boutique under the name Amber and also welcomed Noah into the world, and she also got to enjoy days filled with warmth with her new family. But whenever she thought about the past, she felt a pang in her heart, and when that happened she just folded her hands and prayed, and despite the pain, her last had now become a nourishment for living her present. In a new scene, Jerome informs the Duke that the diplomatic negotiations were going smoothly and neither Vintgar nor Trieste desired war, so if they could at least reach an agreement on trade and commerce. But the Duke cuts him off and asks when he will be leaving for Vintgar, and Jerome says in 2 days' time, and the Duke reminds him to thoroughly review their plans to avoid mistakes, as the upcoming visit was a very important opportunity for him and House Blackwell. Later, Angie sits with her new family and Martin's father-in-law informs them that the royal family of Trieste had visited that morning and they planned to stay in the Vintgar royal palace for the next 3 weeks. Apparently they were there to attend the parade celebrating Vintgar's founding day, but their visit held a greater significance, and the establishment of diplomatic relations between the two countries will mark a significant turning point for Trieste. Martin then asks if it meant Trieste will slowly open its doors, abandoning its long-held isolationist policy, but Angie couldn't wrap her head around the fact that if the Trieste royal family was present, House Blackwell would also be. Martin's father-in-law assures her that the roster of people in the royal entourage provided by members of parliament did not include Duke Blackwell, and Angie wonders why the mere mention of his name still triggered a strong reaction even after 3 years. She recalls how she'd overheard that the Duke was yet to wed his fiancée, and neither did they have a child. The man had explained that he didn't know if it was intentional or whether they were just yet to conceive, and the main issue remained whether eternity still continued to exist, but House Blackwell was so shrouded in mystery that it was impossible to find out. Martin had mentioned it was reassuring that there had been no reports of missing minors in the last 3 years, and they could speculate that they discontinued the use of remedies and ceased performing the eternity ritual. The man had told him he would like to believe that since they could no longer obtain the opium roses which were grown on the land, and while he may be safe due to the passage of time, Angie still remained at risk, and it would be best for them not to let their guards down for the time being, while Angie prays that Kylek sincerely repents for everything in the past and commits no further wrongdoings. In a new scene, a lady welcomes Letitia to the palace, and as she walks she stops when she comes across a familiar embroidery design on their tablecloth, and the lady asks if it's to her liking. She tells her it was Madame M's creation, and she was now renowned throughout the capital for her fine work, and even though she didn't follow trends, her designs were delicate and sophisticated. Letitia recalls how when they were younger she'd embroidered something beautiful, and after they'd pondered on a couple of professional names for her boutique in the future, they settled for Madame Marigold. Letitia says it isn't to her liking and asks where the Duke is, and is informed that he was in a meeting to establish diplomatic relations, and as a result will be difficult to see him until the Founding Day Parade is over. The Founding Day Parade finally arrives, and Angie rushes to Madeline and owners of a boutique in the Citadel, who informs her that the consul's wife had explained that her designs were lovely, but the spelling of the child's name was incorrect and should be spelt with a K instead of CH, as it would be pronounced like that in Vintgar, but the baby's godfather was from Vincentine, and Angie recalls how Michael's name wasn't spelled the usual way. The lady asks if Angie would come to her shop to embroider the baby's name again, and as she's about to respond she hears a loud noise, and the lady tells her it must mean that the parade had already started. She convinces Angie to attend the parade since she hadn't seen one before, and Angie accepts. Angie stands engulfed by the beauty of the ceremony, and as she says it's beautiful she becomes pale with terror as she spots a familiar image. It was Kylek. Angie turns around and tries to escape before she catches the Duke's eye, but she moves too late as the Duke hurriedly gets off the carriage chasing after her in the parade. She arrives at home, rushes to Noah, and Bryn asks her what is going on. She tells her he's in Vintgar and he seemed to have recognized her, so he suggests she goes into hiding until the delegation from Trieste leaves Vintgar. He tells her to head to Levon and he'll look into the details of the situation, and if it appears to be serious she should go to her aunt in Rorschach. Bryn comforts her and says the Duke didn't seem to know about Noah yet and they seem to have stopped performing the Eternity ritual, and Angie says it might be prudent for her not to take Noah along just to be safe. Bryn assures her that they'll take care of Noah, and Angie thanks her and says she'll leave as soon as she finishes the work she had left and she should explain everything for her to Martin. She remembers the Duke's face the moments he'd seen her and tries to stop herself from thinking about him, and she tells Bryn that in case anything happens to her she'll trust her with Noah. In a new scene, the Duke informs Jerome that they must find Angie before they return back to Trieste, and she seemed to be wearing a brown wig, casual clothes, as if she was just out for a stroll. He orders him to expand their searches to the outskirts of the citadel, and Jerome nods and suggests she get some rest since he'd spent hours scouring the streets. The Duke sighs, thinking of how his heart wouldn't stop racing and how she was buried among the crowd, but it felt like the world around her faded into a blur as he'd recognized her at once. As he calls out her name and asks how he couldn't recognize her, someone rushes to him and informs him that the king had gone missing and they were searching every corner of the palace with the help of Vintgar's royal guards, but they still hadn't found him, and the last time his attendants had seen him it was around the time the parade was ending. This king was Rainier VIII, the puppet king of Trieste with the faintest of hearts, and if anyone harbored intentions of making an attempt on his life, it is the second in line to the throne who was biding his time for an opportunity to depose his older brother. The Duke orders them to investigate what Grand Duke Winston had been doing, particularly those he had been meeting with in secret. In a new scene, some guards discuss that as they'd anticipated, the parade in town was the perfect opportunity, since while all the Vintgar royal guards flocked to the parade, the puppet king remained cooped up in his palace, and their new master had made a wise decision. A guard turns and asks a person named Shadow if he isn't dozing off, and the person who walks out turns out to be Mikhail. Mikhail asks if he was saying the plan was to follow the new master's orders and dispose off the king, and after saying yes he reminds him to leave evidence as if it was done by someone from Vintgar, as only then will their master be able to provide a justification for cutting off diplomatic ties with Vintgar. Mikhail remembers how Gertrude had told him it was a must that he contacted Grand Duke Winston and obtained secret orders from him without anyone finding out, and also without attracting the lordship's notice. The guard continues and says their master's plan was to extort compensation from Vintgar before shutting the doors on them again, while eliminating the thorn in his side in the process, and what their master and the Privy Council ultimately desired was a perpetual class-based society, and Mikhail asks them where the puppet is being held. In a new scene, the Duke informs some people that since the Vintgar's royal family had granted authorization, it was now time to close off the royal palace, and no one from Trieste will be allowed to leave the citadel until the king is found. The Duke also informs them that all correspondence, carrier pigeons, and communication with outsiders will be strictly prohibited, and the guards will also be held accountable for their oversight at a later date. A man tells him they must inform Trieste of the situation, but the Duke tells him there would be little point, and since the Vintgar's family had agreed to deploy a large number of soldiers to assist with the search, there will be no shortage of manpower, and even if something had befallen the king, whether or not Trieste knew about it will make no difference. The Duke tells them the celebration if the nation's founding will continue until the day after the next day, and with all the busy activities downtown the search should proceed smoothly, and also people wouldn't find it strange to see soldiers everywhere, as they will assume they were for the purpose of security. The man speaks again and tells the Duke he didn't know if the Vintgar royal family could be trusted, since the king had disappeared during festivities attended by the entire Vintgar royal family at a time when Vintgar's most elite guards were deployed outside the palace. The Duke tells him it couldn't be the doings of the royals there, and they should turn what he just said on its head, since while Vintgar elite guards were stationed outside, the guest palace was completely surrounded by Trieste's cavalry, and he asks who he would suspect if kidnapping or assassinating the king. They remain quiet, and the Duke tells them the Vintgar's royals are aware of the possibility, and they are currently feeling considerable pressure, and given that they were the ones who'd invited them there, they will feel morally responsible for any misfortune that befalls them, and he'd suggest that instead of fostering distrust and suspicion they should review their willingness to assist favorably and use it to their diplomatic advantage. the Duke suggests to them that for the time they spend there they refrain from leaving the guest palace for their own safety and that they have guards accompany them at all times even within the palace. As the Duke walks with Jerome, he tells him he had suspicions about Grand Duke Winston as the timing was too good, and even though it was never officially announced, the king was scheduled to have an audience with the King and Queen of Vintgar immediately after the parade and festival concluded to call for the abolition of monarchy in Trieste and to seek support for national elections. Jerome asks if that was the decision he'd made, and the Duke says because he wished to escape and he didn't seem interested in eternity anymore. The Duke pauses and asks if Mikhail was still there and he should arrange for someone to discreetly tail him and they should remain inconspicuous and follow him closely for as long as needed, and when Jerome asks if he doesn't trust him, he tells him he couldn't trust anyone at the moment, so he should assign someone to follow him just while they're in Vintgar. The Duke suddenly begins to cough blood, and when Jerome asks if he should call for a physician, he tells him he just needed rest. Jerome tells him he'd been coughing up blood too frequently, and the Duke assures him he'll receive treatment once he returns to Trieste with Angie, so he was all right at the moment and he had to be. In a new scene, a man walks discreetly to the King of Trieste who was tied up in a room. It turns out to be Mikhail, and he just tells him worthless scums like him always met their end that way, and there was also no point in revealing his identity, but he supposed he owed him that one last courtesy. As he raises the knife to him, he tells him his name was Mingle Rendell, and after getting it done he leaves the crime scene while the king tries to scribble something on the ground. In a new scene, two men sit taking beer and a man tells him he'd picked up a rather peculiar stranger at Lübeck Central Station a few days ago and he couldn't see her face as it was hidden under a bonnet, but he had the feeling she was a noblewoman dressed up in a plain attire to conceal her identity. The man asks him what was strange about it, and he says it was odd for her to be heading to such a remote location at dawn, and when she disembarked at Levon Lake, a man who seemed to be her attendant handed him a tip which was 5 times the usual fare for the carriage ride. The other man excitedly asks if that meant it was hush money, and the man responded that it was as they'd told him not to mention to a soul about taking them to Levon, and a man who looks like Mikhail in a cloak chuckles and takes his leave. Later, as Angie spreads some sheets, she turns to find Mikhail by her side. He tells her earlier a woman carrying a loaf of bread who looked so much like her walked by, and he apologizes for tailing behind her without a word, but he believed all those time that something terrible had happened to her that time, and she tells him she did suffer an accident but she'd received help from someone and survived, and also managed to reunite with her long family members and regain all her memories. Mikhail smiles and tells her it was something to celebrate as it meant she'd managed to break free from the shackles of eternity by her own strength, and she remained remarkable as ever. Angie asks Mikhail how he's been because she'd heard the whole island burned down, and he suggests they discuss it over a meal. She agrees and asks him to wait for her at a lake nearby as she had to make dinner for her grandmother first. Angie goes in, and after a while of speaking she notices her grandmother wasn't there, and after searching the house she comes to find a note on a table, and as she picks it up she trembles. It read, "I have arranged for a car to wait for you at the back in trance. I have no intention of harming your grandmother, but I would advise you not to seek help from anyone, and I hope you will choose wisely." Angie drops to the floor, and after a while of trying to comfort herself she packs a bag and goes into the car. She finally arrives and Kai welcomes her in. She stands for a while before finally asking where he was holding her grandmother, and his eyebrows furrow as she pleads with him to send her home. He tells her she was in Levon of her own accord and he'll send word for her to be escorted home. He asks Angie if there was anything she'd like to ask, and she says yes, and she has a lot of questions. She asks what it is he wanted from her and if he still intended to make her his mistress, and he calls out her name. He sighs before admitting that all he'd wanted to confirm was that she was safe and clear up any misunderstandings between them. Angie tells the Duke that nothing he says can change the events that had already happened, and he tells her his relationship with Letitia was purely for appearances, and had she not become betrothed to him her life would have been in jeopardy just like any other remedy. He explains to Angie that Letitia wasn't Harold Durbin's real daughter and she was merely a sacrificial lamb being used to fulfill his ambitions, and if their engagement had been broken off she would have disappeared without a trace, and he'd wished to protect her from that fate, as since his father's passing he tried to prevent remedies from coming to harm, and he knew Letitia was her closest friend. He explains to her that the day of the incident on the cliff her parents had tried to make her drink amnesiac, a drug that wipes away one's memory, leaving their mind completely blank, so he couldn't just stand by and let it happen. Angie calls him a liar and says she'd already known that they weren't her real parents since she'd regained all her lost memories, but their love for her was genuine and they cherished her as they would their own daughter, and the Duke tells her that was why he had to do it. He tells her they tried to shield her from the truth to preserve her happiness, and he wanted to tell her everything for her sake, as he wanted to live a life of truth with her. Angie then tells him even though all of what he'd said was the truth, she didn't want to dwell on the past anymore, and facing him had been extremely difficult, and she was still unsure what he wanted from her. He tells her he intended to break the curse once and for all, and he goes down on his knees pleading with her to just try him one more time and he will prove himself to her, and when that time comes he hopes she will love him once more. Angie looks at the Duke, recalling how she'd been struggling with the thought that all her time with him was a lie, the sweet nothings he'd whispered, his tender kisses, vows of love, but if there was truth in it that she'd overlooked, and if that's why he didn't give up on her. She tells him she'll be waiting, so after eternity has been completely eradicated and he is finally free, he should come back to her and she will wait until everything is settled. The Duke asks Angie if she'll truly wait for him, and after she nods he sighs and thanks her for giving him another chance, and she tells him her feelings of resentment towards him wouldn't just go away overnight, but she'll to try believe in herself and everything she'd felt for him in the past, so he shouldn't let her down that time, and he promises to tell her nothing but the truth each day. He kisses her head and he says, "And be grateful that I can be by your side again," and he kisses her cheek, but as he tries to lean in for a kiss, the door is kicked open and Jerome informs the Duke that he'd received news that the king's body was found in the citadel a few hours ago, and before he could say any other thing, some men walk in to arrest the Duke on suspicion of assassinating the Emperor of Trieste, and when Jerome tries to speak for the Duke stops him and asks them if they had any evidence. He tells him a poison pen belonging to him was discovered in the Emperor's inner pocket, and if he'd used it at any point even before being abducted he would have been poisoned through contact with his fingers. He tells him the Emperor had also left a decisive clue, which was the first 4 letters of his name, and Angie informs them that name spellings varied from one region to another, and for instance in some regions it might be spelt with a CH whereas in others with a K. The Duke looks at Angie and informs them that he would testify to his innocence at the police station. Angie calls him and he asks her to go home because it isn't safe for her to be there, and he goes to her as if to give her a kiss on her forehead, but he just whispers something to her. As they take him away they talk about an anonymous tip, and tracking the powder would lead straight to the Duke, and the chalk powder scattered on the ground had saved them a lot of time, while Angie wonders who could have done such. As Angie stands in the train station, she hears a familiar voice call her and she turns to Mikhail. He asks if she was all right, and when she asks why he was there he tells her he'd waited around for her that day and she never came, so he went looking for her. Then he'd seen the note she left behind and also the chalk powder and reported it to the police, and since it seemed like there wasn't much he could do there, he was going to head back to Trieste. He asks Angie what had happened to her and she tells him how she'd met Lord Kylek, and while talking they managed to clear up the misunderstandings that had built up over time, and he'd also explained his relationship with Letitia and explained he was trying to put an end to eternity. Mikhail asks if she's decided to join hands with the Duke again, and she says while she doesn't fully trust him yet, if he returns to her after fulfilling his promises then she would live to take his hand again, and that was how she felt. Mikhail tells Angie he will help her, and he heard he'd been arrested on charges of assassinating the Emperor, so she should come with him to Trieste to testify on his behalf, as House Blackwell supporters will welcome any testimony that can clear his name even at the cost of public trust, and Angie asks if he could give her a little more time since she'd like to send a letter home. In a new scene, a man asks why the Duke would do such, and the man who'd arrested him asks if it wasn't obvious that it was an act of rebellion as he'd like to usher in a new emperor, but the man asks if House Blackwell wasn't already powerful enough without the backing of the throne. A man says the wrist of the corpse was tilted slightly to the right, which shows he started writing the name from the middle and not the beginning, and the reason why there was another letter in front of Kyle must have been because the ink wasn't flowing well, causing it to get darker from the middle, though it was blood and not ink. Martin sits quietly thinking of how the slashes of the knife were merciless and also meticulous erasure of tracks with no hint of hesitation, meaning it could only have been done by someone accustomed to murder. He suddenly gets a flashback to a time on the island where a boy with white hair mercilessly committed murder, and he holds his mouth wondering why that memory suddenly resurfaced, and his eyes fills with realization as he remembers the cruel boy's name was Mikhail, while Bringitz reads the letter from Angie. On the train, Mikhail tells Angie that since she'd likely mentioned his name in her letter he'd thought of intercepting it before it got there, but he'd realized it didn't matter since she was now with him and they'll never be apart again. He kisses her hair and tells her they will find their own haven where he will build just for her, and he loves her. In a new scene, Jerome informs Letitia that she has to leave before they go to question her again because if she didn't she could fall into Harold's hand again, and the Duke had wished for him to tell her that he was sorry for making her a sacrificial lamb. She grabs her coat, finally accepting everything, and before she leaves she demands to know if Angie is safe. In a new scene, Grand Duke Winston goes to visit the Duke Devonshire in his cell. He tells him he seemed to have built quite the reputation for himself seeing as half of the Privy Council continues to defend him, and he says it's because he is innocent beyond doubt. He tells the Grand Duke he was in the guest palace around the time of the crime, and unless he was capable of splitting his body into two how could he have murdered the Emperor, but the Grand Duke just signals for them to be left alone. The Grand Duke tells him to make his confession since it was just the two of them and he'd meant that the outcome would be determined by the triumph of good over evil, and it was almost certain that he would ascend the throne, so he would have nothing to fear. The Duke gets up, and as he walks to him he tells him he's sorry to disappoint him, but he wasn't afraid even then, which provokes the Grand Duke. A man comes to the Grand Duke with a letter from the Blackwell Manor, and as the Duke spots the red seal he thinks of how it couldn't be used by anyone except the head of the house, but the Grand Duke just laughs and orders him to deliver the letter to the Justice of the Supreme Court as it was a statement from a long-serving housekeeper of House Blackwell. Louise Dunst had offered a testimony written by herself to them, and the Duke lived in complete desolation. The Grand Duke tells Kylek he had no further recourse and officially endorses Mikhail Randall, the illegitimate son of the late Duke, as the interim head of House Blackwell. The Duke, not intimidated, tells him he had no concern for any of that, and in his mind he thinks of how his last words to her were, "I will come for you soon, and when I do I hope you will allow me to kiss you," and he thinks that no harm must befall her. Angie wakes up finally, and Mikhail looks outside and says they called the place they were Te Deum, a hymn of praise to God, and in his head he thinks my Te Deum is a fitting name, and he turns to Angie and says, "And my Angie." Angie sits on the bed in a revealing outfit and she asks Mikhail what was happening since they were supposed to go to the Trieste, but she was there, and she asks why she was in that fit, but Mikhail just tells her the Duke was beyond hope as he would undergo a fair trial for his crime and his sentence will likely be determined within a few days, and he asks what could possibly be changed by going to Trieste. Mikhail goes down and asks Angie that they start over, just the two of them, and she asks what he was talking about and says something was wrong with him because he wasn't the Mikhail she knew. He tells her he thinks she's familiar with someone who's like him in many ways, and he reveals the goose pattern on his chest. He tells Angie he is Kylek Blackwell's half-brother and he's been taking eternity just like him since when he was young, but eyes and hair changed color because of its side effects, and he had to spend 10 years in hiding so the secret wouldn't come to light, and then he'd met her and she became his sole savior. He tells Angie that now that he would become the head of House Blackwell nothing would come between them and they'll build a life there together, but she hits his hand off. She tells him she doesn't live with him and she doesn't know how that misunderstanding came about, and as she tries to escape Mikhail's sighs and says I suppose she'll need some time to come to terms with reality. Angie rushes to a man and begs him to take her out with him, but he just apologizes and says he's a servant of House Blackwell, and just as she's pleading, Mikhail arrives and signals Gertrude to take the rest of the maids inside. As Angie stands there, Mikhail goes to her and tells her he's sorry, but nothing she does will work as no one could leave without his permission. Angie turns to him with so much resentment in her eyes and says if this is truly how you are, then you're no different from your grandfather, because at least Kai had made a genuine effort to repent for his family's sins and bring about the end of eternity, but Mikhail just slaps her and says it's enough from her as he didn't want to hear it, and he thinks she needed to spend some time by herself until she comes to her senses. He throws her into a cell, and as she sobs she thinks of how she needed to get out to see if what Mikhail had said was true when she hears someone call her name. In a new scene, the Duke is tied to a chair and the Grand Duke says maybe instead of sending him to the gallows they should make him work as an escort, and with people forming endless lines every day the state coffers will soon be filled to the brim, and the Duke just asks if that was his way of expressing the lust he felt for him. The Grand Duke asks if he thought himself to be clever and informs him that his loyal servant Jerome had gone to visit him the day before and he'd gotten on his knees and begged him to deliver a message to his master. He asks if it was Angie and he informs him that his former mistress was at the Blackwell estate in southern Scarborough, a place called the Drum, and since House Blackwell had a new head it seemed she'd fallen head over heels for Michael. The Duke asks if he should tell him what he wanted to know and says Duke John Fitzgerald Blackwell, the founder of their family, lived until the age of 103 until the Great Fire ravaged their island. The Grand Duke is suddenly filled with so much interest and he asks if since he'd burned to death it meant he wasn't immortal, and the Duke tells him at that time they were still working on improving the side effects of eternity, the elixir of immortality. He tells him there were a few other conditions besides that, but they didn't seem to be in the appropriate venue for such a discussion. The Grand Duke then asks him if he wasn't aware that depending on what he chose to do there he could be pardoned immediately due to insufficient evidence, and he tells him that all the secrets lied in the Te Deum, for it is the new Cullinan Island. The Duke remembers how he'd asked Jerome to be discreet about sending Angie back so she doesn't attract attention, and also her grandmother and Letitia. He'd asked about the drug development and Jerome had replied that it is expected to be completed soon as he's heard they'd finished the clinical trials, and he'd said he will remain in jail until the drug is complete, and when the time is right he should send a signal by coming with a plausible excuse to keep the Grand Duke from suspecting anything and then look for him. The Duke tells the Grand Duke that if he could ensure his release he will personally guide him to where the family secrets are hidden, and he agrees and says he'll have him transferred to the prison in the royal palace for the time being, but the pardon will have to wait as it will take a few days until the Privy Council and Judicial Assembly can be convened for approval. The Duke tells him to publicly let it be known that he was staying there as it would be to his advantage if Te Deum remained unaware of their new arrangement, and he agrees and says in 3 days' time he will pay a surprise visit to Te Deum when he will accompany him disguised as his bodyguard. The Duke thinks of Angie and says if anyone tries to lay a finger on her, he will rip their hearts out and tear it to shreds. Angie turns to find Annette and she tells her she'd overheard the maids talking and had a feeling it might be her, and so much had changed since they moved to that island, and even though she had a lot to tell her she had to go, and she encourages her to hang in there. Michael goes to Angie and says when she looks all pitiful like that it breaks his heart. He leans in and just as he says her name he hears her say Noah, apologizing with tears pouring down her face. He gets up and asks Louis if that's what they called fate, because while examining the documents for eternity he came across an intriguing fact, and it turns out the first person to partake in eternity wasn't his grandfather but someone else. He tells her that it was said that 100 years ago the abbot of Roche Monastery in Crochet Province had lived to be 98 years old after sacrificing the blood of his nephew, since he'd wished to avoid the trouble of sacrificing 2 children for the eternity ritual. He orders her to bring him a midwife, someone both skilled and experienced, and as he kisses Angie's head he says they must check if Angie's body bore any signs of childbirth, and if she indeed had a child, they must find it by all means. She asks if he was suspecting the child was born from a union with Kylek, and he says it wasn't merely a suspicion and he was in fact sure of it because Angie would never have carried another man's seed. Louise informs him that the imperial delegation will soon arrive in Te Deum, and he asks if that meant the Grand Duke planned to bring his people to pressure them into revealing secrets of the eternity. He tells her they must have a card up their sleeve as well, and he asks her not to just stand there like a fool. He turns to Angie and says he'll be back the next day and will forgive her for her waywardness, so he hopes she'll extend him the same goodwill. In a new scene, they stand outside in the pouring rain and Michael asks Louise if everything including the substance was ready as well, and she reports that they'll provide water and tea as soon as they arrive and everything for the meal was fully prepared for use. As the Grand Duke speaks Michael could tell he was completely intoxicated, which meant the substance had worked, and finally the Grand Duke asks about the secret of immortality. Michael laughs it off and the Grand Duke tells him there is no need to pretend since he already knew everything. He takes another sip of the wine and Michael tells him that House Blackwell possessed a doctrinal text known as the Black Mass detailing methods on how to attain eternal life, and he asks him to bring it to him. Michael tells him that in order to attain immortality he will have to sacrifice his first son, and asks if he was ready to do that. The Grand Duke gets up, angered by his statement, and Michael repeats to him that he must offer his first child as sacrifice to fulfill the fundamental conditions for the ritual. Mikhail tells him he can simply have another child and asks if his son is that valuable to him that he wouldn't give him up for a mortal life. As the Grand Duke reminds him how he'd elevated him to the position he's in, he feels a sharp pain in his chest and falls to the floor spitting blood, and the same with the others that had eaten the meal. The Grand Duke asks what he'd put in the meal, and he tells him they'd all ingested poison, as he still had a few seeds of the deadly plant that grew only on Cullinan Island, enough to put in the wine, water, and tea they were all served. He tells him it doesn't react with silver, and those who grew on the island like him were immune to it. He orders someone to scour the surroundings and ensure there is none left breathing and that no one escapes, while Kylek stands outside in the rain. Annette frees Angie and tells her there were a lot of ships at the dock and it was her chance to escape. She tells her that she thought only the Grand Duke will be visiting, but all the police officers from Vintgar swarmed in as well. In the main building, a man informs them that he was there to escort Kylek Road Blackwell, and the other man asks if he wasn't aware that the Duke was currently imprisoned in the capital. The man reveals a written approval from Vintgar royal family and parliament, and it seemed news hadn't reached them, but the Duke had been specially pardoned due to lack of evidence, and they'd merely come there because they thought he'd be there. The man tells him that they'd have to conduct another investigation, and since they had a strong suspicion on who the culprit might be, it is likely that the accusations will be dropped and he'll be released soon. They ask why the Duke is being taken by Vintgar instead of Trieste, and the man informs them that Lord Kylek Blackwell was now a citizen of Vintgar, and an application for asylum to the royal court was made during the recent diplomatic mission, and it was formally approved a few days ago. As Angie and Annette escape from the building, Mrs. Dunst grabs Annette and places a knife to her neck. Angie begs her to let her go, and she tells her that if she wanted her to live she will have to forget about escaping, and if she didn't it would be Annette's end. Angie submits to her, and she says she should have gotten rid of her a long time ago, but at least they'll be able to carry out the final ritual with her child. The light suddenly goes off, and as Kylek cocks a gun he asks Louise to speak. He asks her if Angie has a child, and when she says yes, he goes to Angie and asks if it was his, and as Louise says yes, he finally pulls the trigger. Angie asks if it really is him, and he apologizes for coming late. He hugs her and asks her why she's lost so much weight and also what she was wearing. He asks if it was all Mikhail's doing, and she assures him that she is now all right. He informs her that Jerome had prepared a boat behind the chapel, and just as they walk, Kai suggests he go get some light, and just as Angie speaks, Mikhail grabs her from behind and asks Kylek to drop the gun. He tells him their fight will only end with one of them meeting their demise, and he asks him to jump, saying death will be almost instantaneous in those deep waters. He tells him if he truly wished to save Angie he would, but Angie begs him to let Kyle go and she'll go with him willingly. He smiles, asking if she would, even if it meant never seeing him again, and he gets lost in Angie's gaze. He notices blood dripping. Angie tells him he can take her with him, but she would never let him harm Kai. Annette kicks him down, and the Duke grabs Angie, and they both fall into the ocean. In the main building, the man wonders what had happened there with the bodies on the floor when they come to inform him that someone had fallen into the lake. Angie, sinking down into the oceans, thinks it truly was the end after everything she'd endured, when a strong hand grabs her, thinking they'll never be apart again. They are rescued, and once Angie regains consciousness she asks about the Duke and turns to find Kai injured. She takes a scissors and makes a cut on her hand, explaining to them that he needed her blood. Angie's eyes fill with worry as she looks at the Duke, and he finally pulls her and bites her hand, taking another gulp of blood, and after getting back himself Angie faints. 3 months later, the Duke sits with a letter informing him that human blood were categorized into different types, and that was why some remedies were found compatible with their masters, and they could have stopped a lot from happening if they'd known that fact, and he will no longer be plagued by his curse. The Duke pushes his window open and turns to find his son running to him, and he picks him up. Noah tells him he'd made some cookies with Annette, and when he asks about his mum the Duke hushes him and explains that his mother was dreaming a very happy dream. He goes to her and kisses her head, and she immediately gets up, asking how long she was asleep for, but the Duke just gives her a cookie. She asks if the medication Jerome had sent was having any side effects, and he says yes, although he'll have to observe its side effects a while longer since it was new. Angie asks the Duke if he realized he often touched that spot unconsciously, and as his eyes filled with much regret she assures him it no longer hurts and they'd promised each other not to dwell on the past. As Angie smiles he thinks about how sometimes he often thought of how if his family hadn't initiated the eternity she might have lived a happy and peaceful life, one where their paths never would have crossed, and she'll never know the shiver that runs down his spine whenever he thought about it, and after all the misfortunes they'd endured he could genuinely be happy as he finds solace in the belief that their trials had brought them together. You'll be there smiling brightly, reaching out your hand to me as always, and that's why I'm offering this prayer today, a prayer of gratitude to my grandfather who'd unknowingly brought us together. May he find rest in the depths of hell and may God bless his demise. The end. Thanks for watching, like and subscribe for more amazing recaps.